Hello, beautiful people, and welcome. Hi. To a banner review. They have just announced the banners for Xianyun and Nahida. So obviously, Xianyun and Nahida are the 5 stars, and we have Noelle, Faruzan, and Gummy. Personally, I'm very happy with this banner because I need constellations on Faruzan, and Gummy's a new character. However, this is not a great banner for newer players. Faruzan's a character that isn't particularly good before her C6, and is actually pretty alright, if not pretty good, once she does have her C6, which makes it so that if you can actually get all the way to her C6, she can be alright, but if you can't, her being on the banner isn't helpful. And on top of that, if you are a new player, you probably don't really have the animal carries with whom she actually works. And so even if you did get her C6, it wouldn't do that much for you. You'd be able, I guess, to use her with Xianyun, do like Xianyun carry, but that's probably not going to be a great way to play her. It'll work, but it won't be great. Noelle is obviously not a great unit. She, now with Farina, has some use case where she's a bit more relevant, obviously, but she's not a particularly good unit. And she has a similar issue, although not as big, but definitely still present, where she is relatively constellation reliant. Her C6 does help her quite a bit. And then finally, Gaming is actually a relatively decent carry, but from what I've looked at, and again, he's not out yet, so I haven't tested him, so obviously take this with a grain of salt, but from what I've looked at, I think that without Bennett's C6, he himself just won't be that great at low constellations, and I expect him to actually be pretty good even without Bennett's C6 if he is high constellation, but not if he isn't, and new players might not have enough primos to actually go deep enough on the banner to get C6 on a 4-star. Now, for new 4 stars, for 4 stars you don't already have, on average, it takes you about as many wishes to get them at C6 as it does to get a 5-star character at C2. It's a lot of wishes. I just don't think it's a particularly good banner for new players because of how constellation reliant these two characters are. And even with constellations, Noelle is like, I mean, she's all right in teams that rely on other 5-star units that are pretty good, and even then she's not that great in my opinion. But yeah, we can very quickly go over her constellations. C1 actually kind of helps with her frequency of healing, especially in Farina teams where the healing actually matters, but it's not a huge deal. C2 is actually pretty good. Now, something I've noticed playing a lot of Noelle is that her AoE in general tends to feel a lot better when you're charge attacking than when you're not, right? So if you're using normal attacks, right, they don't hit much behind her. They're mostly in front of her. And then obviously the last one is like very small AoE. Whereas if you're using charge attacks, they're in a large area and you're not limited to auto-targeting. You can move in whichever direction you want, right? This makes it so that even though the size of the attack is relatively similar for normal and charge attacks, the fact that you can actually control where the center is and that the center is on you rather than off center makes it so that when you need to keep hitting enemies for a consistent period of time, her AoE just tends to be a lot more easy to consolidate when you're doing charge attacks. And then obviously, if you are doing charge attacks, then the constellation that buffs your charge attack damage and reduces its stamina cost is pretty relevant. That being said, again, right, her damage, if she's only at C2, is not all that great, so it's, yeah. C3 doesn't really do too much, helps your shield a little bit, helps your healing a little bit, but yeah. C4 is pretty nice. It gets her like a nice little amount of like backloaded damage. Obviously, it scales with her attack, and she's a defense scaler, but she's not a real defense scaler. She converts her defense to attack, so this will deal a lot of damage. C5, pretty nice. It obviously increases your defense to attack ratio, and C6 also significantly increases the defense to attack conversion ratio. Next, we have Faruzan. And the thing with Faruzan is that honestly, basically all her constellations suck except C6. C1 doesn't really do anything unless you're on-fielding her, and that is a decision of all time for sure. Unfortunately, she has particle generation ICD, which means that shooting off 2 hurricane arrows doesn't generate energy twice, so this generally doesn't tend to do very much. C2 increases her ult's duration, which is actually relatively relevant for Xiao teams. It's not that relevant for Wanderer teams because his field time tends to be a little bit bit lower, but it is still relevant because, you know, sometimes you dash or you want to start your rotation with Faruzan or whatever, and that can give you some more wiggle room. So it's still nice in those teams, but it's just a bit less relevant. C3, that's the skill one, right? And skill talent levels just slightly increase skill damage, which doesn't really do much. Constellation 4, it's a little bit of energy, but the reality is that, again, you're getting one of these per rotation. So at most, that's like 4 energy, which is not great. C5 increases her ult damage, which slightly increases the amount of animo damage percent you get. It's not all that significant though, but it also increases the actual damage that she does. The main issue with that is that if she's not C6, her ER requirements will be so high that it's really hard to justify building her for damage. You kind of just have to put whatever piece that has the most ER on her and just fucking hope you get your ult back. But then at C6, it significantly increases her buff, and it makes it so that her ult generates pressurized collapses from her skill, which can generate animal particles that are good for her and for other characters in the team. On top of that, it retroactively makes other constellations better, right? You get pressurized collapses, which deal more damage based on your skill talent level, etc. Her C6 is just a really big deal, and she's just not a character that is all that good without it. And then finally, we have Gumming. If you want to know more about overall what I think about Gumming, you should feel free to check out the Gumming pre-release video. But very quickly, just going over the constellations, C1 is kind of whatever. Like it's fine, but it doesn't really do too much. You're generally running him with a healer anyways, so this doesn't change much. C2 is basically 20% attack. It's all right. C3, I believe that's the skill one. Yeah, it's pretty good. C3 is pretty all right. It's just a pretty straightforward damage increase. It matters more in teams where you're playing him without C6 Bennett, because with C6 Bennett, more of his damage comes from normal attacks, but without it, then basically almost all of his damage comes from skill, which makes it so that this matters a little bit more, but it's still good even with C6 Bennett. Constellation 4 generates a little bit of energy, which is actually relatively nice. You effectively get 8 to 12 energy per rotation, generally 8 or 10, which effectively reduces ER requirements a decent amount. Constellation 5, burst talent levels don't really do too much because it only increases the upfront damage from the burst, which is not all that high, all things considered. It is his biggest hit, but it is not the majority of his damage because his other hits hit more often. And then finally, his C6, it gives his elemental skill 20% crit rate and 40% crit damage and a bigger AoE. It's his best constellation by far. It has like one thing that I don't think I ended up mentioning enough in the pre-release, but this crit rate can make it a little bit harder to build him in the sense that it will make weapons that give you crit rate a lot worse. In order to work around that, you can either, instead of running him on Maréchaussée, you can run him on another set, but other sets just do so much less. So another option that you can have is to just run him on an EM weapon instead, or a crit damage weapon if you have one of those. But I mean, anyways, it's still a very, very good con. That's it for the 4 stars. Now on the 5 stars, and that's why I'm like a bit torn on this banner. These are actually pretty good 5 stars. Nahida obviously doesn't really need an introduction. He's pretty good. Xianyun is good, but a lot more situational. She needs specific other units to really truly shine. I think that Xianyun is a lot worse for people who don't have Farina, and so she's a bit less good for new players in my opinion. But if you started on the Farina banner and you already have Farina, then she is a decent amount better. But she is also a lot better if you have C6 Bennett than if you don't. That's another thing you might want to consider. As a general rule, I'd say that Nahida is, between these two, definitely the better option if you don't already have her. And then when it comes to if you already are getting these characters, how much you get from vertical investment into them, Nahida's C1 is kind of Nahida's C2 is pretty good. Nahida's signature weapon ain't it, chief. It's fine. I'd say that in general, I wouldn't recommend getting either her C1 or her signature. In almost every team, something else is going to be a better option than either of those. But if you have enough to get to her C2 in one shot, then her C2 can actually be a pretty good way of vertically investing into your teams. With Xianyun, I'm a little bit less certain. I think it's relatively reliant on the team if it's better to go into her cons or into her signature weapon. A lot of the teams that she can be used in can very easily struggle with energy generation, and getting the particles from her C1 actually matters a lot more in those teams, but it can still kind of be scuffed because of her skill cooldown not lining up with 20-second rotations too well. If you're only going for one, then her signature weapon is a lot better than her C1. If you're going for two, I think that her C2 is better than C1 plus signature. If you're going for three, probably C2 R1. I think that the biggest issue with her weapon is that there are teams where she doesn't really need the additional energy that you get from it, and in those teams it just doesn't do too much. But I mean, to be fair, in those teams her C1 doesn't do much either. Yeah, her C1 is also a relatively nice exploration thing because it just lets you use your E more. I mean, technically it's not more often because it doesn't change the cooldown, but you generally don't need to use it as soon as it's off cooldown when you're exploring, so it can still be a nice quality of life thing. Her weapon is not very good on anyone else. Moving on to the weapon banner, and this is probably the biggest obstacle to going for her weapon if you want to vertically invest into her, is that, well, 1,000 Floating Dreams is not very good. It's not completely terrible, but it's not great. 1,000 Floating Dreams is kind of just a whatever weapon. Sacrificial Fragments is a nice weapon to have for characters like Sucrose, but there are a decent amount of teams where Sucrose can get away with using TDDS. The Sacrificial Sword can be good on Singso and is a pretty decent option for Kazuha. It's alright. Sacrificial Greatsword can be a good option on Navia, but not at low refine, and only for Navia. Sacrificial Bow is kind of just bad. The only characters that can use it tend to prefer using Fav, and Fav Bow is a weapon that is given for free to everyone. You get it from the Mondstadt story, and so therefore Sac Bow's value goes down. It's fine on Cole, basically. Cole is probably the only character who prefers it over Fav. And then finally, Lithic Spear is definitely a weapon of all time. It can actually be good when you're getting a lot of characters from Leah in your team. But even then, at low refine, it's not great, so it's like, it's very conditional. I'm not a huge fan of it. And like I've talked about earlier, both Faruzan and Gaming are characters that scale very well with their C6. And so that is why, in my opinion, if you're gonna go for vertical investment on these characters, either of these characters, it's probably a little bit better to go on the character banner because you'll just get more useful stuff along the way. But yeah, all in all, this weapon banner, not very good. It's got 2 good weapons, 3 not very good weapons. And if you're going for 1,000 Floating Dreams because you really like Nahida, Crane's Echoing Call doesn't really do anything for you unless you also go for Xianyun. And if you're going for Crane's Echoing Call, 1,000 Floating Dreams doesn't do that much for you, even if you have Nahida, because it's just not that great of a weapon. It's not bad, but yeah. Character banners overall pretty bad for new players when it comes to the 4 stars. For non-new players, they're fine. When it comes to the 5 stars, if you are like completely new to the game, getting Nahida can be good even though the 4 stars aren't the greatest, just because she's pretty good. So that's something you can consider doing for sure. You can also just wait, because I think that it's very likely that the next time Nahida comes around, the 4 stars are going to be better for new players, because I think it's hard to be worse than this for new players. But if you don't want to wait, if you want to invest into new characters now, then getting Nahida can be a good idea maybe. But yeah, that's going to be it for the banner review. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.